Hello and welcome to our webinar today on Southwest Minnesota Arts Council's Quick Support for Organizations grants for our fiscal year 22, which runs from July 1st, 2021 through June 30th, 2022. I am Carolyn Koska, the grants administrator here at Southwest Minnesota Arts Council. And I'll just start out running down a little list of what we're going to talk about today. I'll talk just briefly about Southwest Minnesota Arts Council. We'll look at the guidelines for this grant program. We'll go over to our website and take a look at what resources are available for you there. And from there, we'll head into our grant system and walk through the application. And we'll finish up talking about the grant process. In other words, what happens after you submit an application. I will stop for questions a couple times here. And then at the end, if you'd like to talk more about your specific projects, we can do that. So Southwest Minnesota Arts Council, or SMOC, is a nonprofit organization committed to promoting and encouraging the development of the arts in the 18 counties of Southwest Minnesota by serving as a source of funds and technical services, which enable local organizations, educational institutions, and individuals to sponsor, create, and promote the arts in their communities. Here is our region down in the southwest corner of the state. We are one of 11 regional arts councils covering the whole state of Minnesota. Our funding comes mostly from the state with an allocation from their general fund and mainly through the Arts and Cultural Heritage or Legacy Fund. We also receive funding from the McKnight Foundation, which we use for our grants for individual artists, and from individuals and organizations in our region through memberships and donations. Some things that we are committed to include supporting artists and arts organizations in creating, producing, and presenting high-quality arts activities, overcoming barriers to accessing high-quality arts activities, instilling the arts into the community and public life, supporting high-quality, age-appropriate arts education for all ages to develop knowledge, skills, and understanding of the arts, and supporting events and activities that represent the diverse ethnic and cultural traditions of the region. So these are some things to just keep in mind as you're thinking about grant projects, because everything ultimately should relate back to these commitments. So we'll talk about our quick support for organizations grants. Applicant organizations need to be located within the 18 counties of our service region. They're listed there, or on tribal lands within our service area. We acknowledge that this region occupies the traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of the Dakota people who have stewarded these lands throughout the generations. This is a new program for us this year. It's kind of a combination of some previous programs with some new things. So the kinds of projects that fall under this are planning for an art legacy project, doing a small arts project, a small equipment purchase, development for arts organizations and arts organization startup. And the intent of these quick support grants is to really give organizations a lot quicker access to funds for opportunities that may come up, or when you suddenly are needing to head in a different direction. Those of you who are familiar with us will probably recognize a few of these from previous grants: the Art Legacy Project, the Arts Organization Development, and Arts Organization Startup. Those were their own grant programs before, but now they are within this new quick support program. So we'll take a look at each of these project types. First, art legacy planning. These are open to nonprofit organizations and units of government, which would be a city or a county government. And these are for doing planning for a specific large-scale project that you're expecting will have a strong arts legacy, usually in preparation for applying for an art legacy project grant. These have been most useful in large public art projects. And so as you are planning for that large art legacy project. You can get funding for activities like getting input from your community on what this piece is going to be, the whole process of sending out requests for proposals from artists, paying a few top of your list artists to do those proposals for you so that you come into the actual project knowing who your artist is going to be. Anything related to determining available resources and costs, and also researching feasibility or sustainability of that project. For instance, you might need to investigate the site where you're planning to put this public art. There may be various considerations around that. Then we have the Small Arts Project. Again, open to nonprofit organizations and units of government. The kinds of things this can fund are arts exhibits or performances, art classes for community members, and much smaller public art projects. Any other kind of arts project that you can think of that your organization might want to put on. Then we have our small equipment purchases. Also open to nonprofit organizations and units of government. This would be for purchasing equipment or doing some small facilities improvements that will strengthen the organization's ability to meet art needs in their community. So some of these purchases might include some sound and lighting equipment, art studio equipment, computers, storage, and smaller structural improvements. Then we have arts organization development, and this one is open to arts organizations only. And an arts organization is defined as having a mission focused primarily on the arts. And for this, you can get funding for increasing your long-term stability and capacity through organizational development and management projects. These might include things like having some training for staff or board members, hiring consultants to help your organization in a particular area, conducting surveys if you are thinking maybe of going in a different direction and want to find out what the needs of your community are, and to develop new arts programs and services. And our last project type, arts organization startup, again, open to arts organizations only. And funding for this will go toward developing articles of incorporation and bylaws and filing for 501c3 nonprofit status. So for all of those project types, you can request up to $2,500. And in this current year, there are no matching funds required, which means that your organization doesn't need to put up any funding towards the project unless the project costs more than the amount of the grant. Just to note that organizations that receive operating support from Southwest Minnesota Arts Council cannot include prorated operating costs in the budget for other grants like this one. Then some things to be aware of things that we can't fund. Funding for staff salaries or contracted staff, requests for new building construction, purchase of real estate or endowment funds, educational projects within the school system, projects that don't have an art focus. And then since we are using state funds for this program, we cannot fund activities that take place outside of Minnesota. Religious socialization of the participants or audience, fundraising events. In other words, the grant should make your project break even, not to make a profit. We also can't fund payments of debts incurred before the grant begins, grant funds being used to match another SMOC grant, and applicants with past due final reports. So we've gone over just an overview of the guidelines. It's a good idea to check the guidelines for this program and also our general grant guidelines that apply to all our grant programs, just to make sure all your bases are covered. And I'll show you where you can access those after a bit here. You will need to have a start date and end date for your project. The start date is basically when you're starting anything towards your project. If you're starting to have to pay some fees or contracts, ordering supplies, holding auditions or rehearsals, doing some advertising. So with that in mind, your start date should not be the date of your first activity. You need to give yourself some time to do preparations beforehand. So you can't spend any funds before this project start date. If there is something that absolutely has to be spent early before that date, if you have to, for instance, put down a deposit on a contract really early, then you can't include that amount in your project budget for the grant. You'd have to pay for that completely separately. Then you'll need to also choose a project end date, and all projects awarded this year must be finished up by June 30th, 2023. As far as deadlines go, this is where our quick support comes from. We have deadlines the first of the month, August through April, and the earliest project start date that you can choose is the first day of the following month. So basically, from the deadline to the time when you can begin your project is just a month. Also, be aware that we say deadlines from August through April, but they will only continue as long as we have funding remaining for this program. So it might be a good idea to think about applying a little earlier rather than later. And then I just want to point out too that applications need to be submitted by 4:30 p.m. on the deadline date. The grant system will not allow you to submit after that time. For your project, you're going to need at least 2 people involved. One is the project director. And as it sounds, this is the person who is really most directly responsible for the project. Oftentimes, they also end up writing the grant, but that doesn't have to be the case. And then you'll need your authorizing official, who would be president, treasurer, or somebody else from your organization who has authorizing power. And these need to be 2 different people. They can't be the same person filling both roles. And both of them will need to sign the application, contract, and final report. If your organization does not have 501c3 status or is not a unit of government, you'll need to find an organization that is one of those things to act as your fiscal sponsor. And obviously, arts organization startup applicant would need to use a fiscal sponsor. In your application, you'll need to include a signed agreement between your organization and the fiscal sponsor organization that kind of spells out how this relationship is going to work. So then someone from that fiscal sponsor organization will need to sign your application, contract, and final report. And they will receive the grant funds for you, and they are legally responsible for the completion of the project and managing those funds. And we'll stop now if anyone has any questions.
Hey, Caroline, I missed the very beginning. I'm sorry. I just wanted to make sure, is it that the organizations need to be established for at least 2 years? Is that correct?
No, that's a change that we made for that startup grant. The startup grant was the only one that had that 2-year requirement to start with. And that requirement has been removed. So nothing to worry about there.
So I'm sorry, I'm sure you covered this, but to need a fiscal sponsor, what would be the difference if you'd need a fiscal sponsor if you're established 501c3? As an arts organization, would you need a fiscal sponsor at all?
As long as you have a 501c3, you don't need a fiscal sponsor at all.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm. And hopefully you'll be able to have a little information filled in as we go ahead here over into the website and application. So unless there are any more questions, then that is where we are going to head. So here we are on our website, and on our homepage here, I just want to point out the quickest way to get to our grant system. If you scroll down a little bit below the slides, there's this black grants box with a login button. So that'll be your fastest way to get into that system. And I'll show you another way we can get there as we go look at this grant program. All right, so here is our quick support for organizations. And you'll see right at the top of the page here, there is the Apply Now button. You don't need to actually be applying to click this button. It'll just take you to the login, but that is another place where you can access the system. So you'll see on the page here, it explains the deadlines for this current year. When your grants will be under consideration and your earliest project start date that you can have. Then we've got some links to some materials for you here. Here are the guidelines for this grant program, the general grant guidelines that apply to all of our grant programs that we talked about. Then we've got application questions in a Word document for you. Sometimes people prefer to work on a draft in a Word document first and then paste everything into the application later. So that's there for you if it's something you want to do. Then we've got a couple different options for your budget form, and we'll take a closer look at that once we get in the application. Here are the criteria that the grant panel will be using to review your application, so you can dig into those details of what they're looking for. Coming soon will be a Word document of the final report questions if you want to take a look at that ahead of time or get a head start on that. And then we just have a couple tutorials for the online grant system here. But we are going to go ahead and click our Apply Now button. And like I said, it takes you to the login page. If you already have an account, you could just go ahead and log in. If you are new to the system, there's a Create New Account button here. If you're not sure whether your organization has an account yet or not, please contact us and we can get that straightened out for you so you're not creating extra accounts. So we are going to log in here. So if you are returning to the system and you've worked in here before, you'll come right to your applicant dashboard. And we'll talk more about that later. But if you are coming in here for the first time, you'll be taken to this apply page. So we're going to head over there. And this is a list of all of the grant applications that we have currently available. So you'll just scroll down to find the one we want. Here's our quick support. If you just want to look at the application without actually starting anything, you can hit this preview button. Otherwise, there's this blue apply button up in the corner, and that's what we're going to do. Just waiting for everything to load here. So I'm just going to point out a couple things up at the top of the application here. We have Google Translate embedded into the system. So if you would like to work in a different language, you can select a language here and do that. Then I wanted to point out the Copy Previous Answers button. If your organization has done applications in the system before, you can copy answers over from past applications. That can be a time-saving thing for you, especially for information about your organization's history, which doesn't really change. And then there's this collaborate button here. If you'd like to have somebody else come into the application and maybe add some audience numbers or some work samples, you can invite them here. Just enter in their email address, choose the level of permission you'd like to give them, and you can type a little message here asking them whatever it is you'd like them to do. So once you click invite, that will send them an email, and all they'll need to do is just make a password quickly to access the application. Then as you get started, we've got a couple of ways you can get some questions answered or get help with your application. You can click here to schedule some time with me. You would just choose how you'd like to meet, and then it takes you to a calendar, and you can just pick a time on there, and we can have a conversation. Otherwise, feel free to email any questions to me. My email address is here. So you'll start filling in a name for your project, the amount you're going to be requesting, although you might want to wait until you finished your budget form to enter that in. And then here are the project start and end dates that we talked about. And then the next thing you'll need to do is select which type of project you're applying for. And we'll go through the things that are different between all of these, but we'll start out and run through once clicking on the Art Legacy Project Planning. So that'll bring up questions specific to this project type. Here are some of those documents again that we talked about, and some tips as you're getting started writing. I do want to talk about the character limits. You'll notice that the character limit in most of the fields is quite large, and we're really not expecting you to fill that in. So please don't feel like you need to add a bunch to try and get to that number of characters. Depending on the actual question, you may need to just put a few sentences to a few paragraphs, as long as you are addressing all of the parts of the question. So nothing to worry about there. So for our Art Legacy Planning project, in describing your project, we're asking you to include some certain pieces of information. Describe the project toward which you are planning. Describe what kind of planning you're wanting to do, who will be involved, who is your artistic director, and what are their qualifications. Will you be working with an organization like Forecast Public Art or Springboard for the Arts that will help you with your planning process? What is your process for receiving and using public input, and what is your timeline? So just some points to be thinking about as you are describing what you'd like to be doing. Optionally, you can upload a resume for an artistic director here. Then we'd like you to consider how you will be involving the underserved in your community in this planning project. You're asked to think about which groups in your community might be underserved or underrepresented by your organization, and then what you're going to do to reach out to or involve one or more of those groups that you identified so they can participate in your planning. Gives you some examples of what that might include, and then finally talk about whether your organization has an ADA access plan and how you will ensure that this will be accessible to those with various disabilities. Then you'll need to think about what your goals are for this planning. What kind of impact do you think it will have on the final project? For instance, will it affect the artistic quality of what you're able to do for the final project by being able to do this planning? Will it help the final project be more connected to the needs of your community? Will you feel like, okay, now we're ready to apply for the full grant for this project? Just think about what your goals are, what changes might take place. And then you can talk about how you plan to measure or prove that those changes have taken place. If you're planning to gather some feedback or other results, and then what you will look for in those results that would let you know you've succeeded. You can optionally attach an evaluation tool here if there's a survey that you're using. And then we ask for a few quick numbers on those participating in the project. And keep in mind that these are numbers of those participating in the planning, not in the final project. Then you come to your budget. We have a few options for you as you're filling out a budget. You can use either of these forms that we have available. There's an Excel form and a PDF form. They look very similar. They're just in a different format. Or you can feel free to create your own budget form. For now, we are going to look at the Excel form. Well, usually it doesn't take that long to open. Let's see if it likes the PDF better. So this basically looks the same in the Excel form, but you'll type in your project name up here. You can list all of the costs you think you're going to have and put some amounts in here. You'll see that's totaling your cost for you. Then maybe you've received a donation or have some other income for the project. If this is another project type, you might have admission to your event. So we'll put in some other funding that you might have. And then down here, it'll calculate for you the maximum amount that you can request. So this top number here takes your cash cost minus your other funding. And it says your request cannot exceed $2,000 or the maximum request amount for this grant program, whichever is less. So we'll go down and check our quick support for organizations, 2,500, which of the two is less, the 2,000. So we could request that. Or let's say we are not reading very closely and we decide we're requesting the max $2,500, then you'll see down here on the profit, we've got $500 there. And it reminds us that the profits should equal 0. So either we need to ask for less or use less of our funding toward this project. And you'll see now when I change that, our profit is 0. So you would save and fill out this form, and then you can come back to the application and upload it here, whether you decided to do the Excel, the PDF, or a budget of your own. We've got a budget narrative field here if you want to further break down some of those costs, and maybe that didn't fit into the budget form, or describe those costs in a more narrative way. You're asked some information about your organization, a mission statement, brief history, the type of programs you offer, the primary constituents you serve, and then anything else that you'd like to include there about your organization. A few questions about your board. How are your members chosen? How do you make sure they represent the diversity of your community? How often do you meet? And then we ask that you provide the names, roles, and qualifications of your board members. Either they can also be in this text box along with your answer here, or you can upload an existing board list. We've got a little bit of data that we're collecting. This doesn't have any bearing on your application, just some things that we need to pass on to the state. So you'll enter in what your most recently completed fiscal year, and then you'll have a slightly different question depending on which organization type you pick. So if we choose arts organization, we're asked for our total expenses from that year. If instead we say we're a non-arts organization, we're asked for our estimated expenses specifically for the arts. Then just some questions about demographics and total annual audiences served. So this is different from the question above, which was asking about audience or participants for the specific project. This is your total annual audience. Then just some contact information. You'll enter in the information for your project director, your authorizing official. We have you mark here who is actually the grant writer in case we have some questions and need to contact you. If you answer other, there'll be some space for you to put your information there. Then you're asked whether you're using a fiscal sponsor or not. If you are, then that fields will appear there for you to enter that information. And here's where you will upload that fiscal sponsor agreement that we talked about earlier. Again, just if you're using a fiscal sponsor. And then finally at the end are your electronic signatures. So we're going to head back up to the top and just look at a couple questions that are different for these different project types. So we're going to skip over to our small arts project. And here, when describing our project, we're asked which artists or activities have you chosen and why? Are there any other personnel who will play a large role in your project and what are they doing? Are you collaborating with other community groups? What kind of support might they be providing? What is your timeline and how will you promote this project? So just make sure to touch on all of those points as you're describing your project. Then you are asked to provide some resumes or bios for the artists that are going to be involved. There's a couple upload fields here, along with some samples of their work. We've got some parameters listed here for different types of samples and some handy links for trying to combine images into a PDF, for instance. We've got 8 of these 10 megabyte upload fields for you here. So that gives you, sorry, that is our artist one that has 8. This one has 3 upload fields for you here. Still should be plenty of room for that, along with some link fields. And if you are having trouble getting your work samples in here, please contact us and we can help you with that. That's kind of what's different for these. And then again, with your goals and the impact you're expecting this will have. And for this, you would be thinking about what kind of changes might happen to the artistic skills, knowledge, attitude, or behavior of participants, audiences, and artists. And again, how would you measure that? And then we're back to kind of the same questions that we had before. We'll jump over to our equipment. In describing your project, you'll need to include information on obviously what equipment purchase or facilities improvements are you planning to do. If you're working with a consultant or contractor, why have you chosen them? What are their qualifications? Who's being involved from your organization and what's your timeline? We've got some space for some extra materials that you might have related to that. If you have some pictures of the space or you want to provide more details about actual equipment, you can upload or describe some information here. And here under your goals, how will this project strengthen your organization's ability to provide high quality arts activities? What specific programs will benefit from this project? And again, how do you plan to prove that those particular changes took place? Oops, I went too far. Then for the arts organization development, what development activities are you planning? If you're working with a consultant, why have you chosen them? What are their qualifications? Who from your organization is involved? Do you have assurance of full participation from your board? And what is the timeline of your project? You've got a space here to upload the proposal from your consultant if you would like to do that. And then here for your goals, you're thinking about what changes might happen for your organization's capacity or long-term stability. Changes to skills or attitudes of your board members, staff, volunteers, donors, things like that. So really, depending on which project type, there's only a few questions that are different between these. For the arts organization startup, you're going to be providing a little bit more information about your organization up front. Some of the information that you provided in the other versions of this, but you're asked a lot more here about the arts programming that you offer and how you make your artistic choices. And then providing some samples of your programming that you have done in the past. And again, if you need some help with work samples, just let us know and we can help you out with that. Here it's asking more how you are reaching the underserved in general as an organization, not about them being necessarily involved in this particular project. And again, that information about your board members, and here it also asks for some information about at least 2 key people from your organization. You can either describe them here and their roles and qualifications, or attach resumes. And then finally, you're talking about what you're actually hoping to do with this startup money. Do you still need to develop articles of incorporation and bylaws? Who will be handling legal and accounting things for you? Why did you choose a particular consultant if you're working with them? And what is your timeline? And again, for your goals, what changes might this make to your capacity or stability? So that kind of covers the application here. As you're working, it will be auto saving for you, but you can also click save down here at the bottom or submit when you're ready. We're going to click save for now. And you'll see it tells you these are all of the questions that are remaining. So that can be helpful to kind of check your progress. If you want to continue, you would just click continue here, but we are actually going to head back to our dashboard. And you'll see here's the application that we just started. If you want to come back to that, you'll just click edit application here. And this is the same place that you come back to fill out a contract and final report. You can access those right on your dashboard here. So we are going to head back over to our slides for a minute, and I will stop again here to see if there are any questions. I'm not hearing any questions, so we can continue on. Just a few tips as you are working on your application. It's a good idea to start early so that you have time to gather all the pieces that you're going to need if you need some work samples or your fiscal sponsor documents. And so you also have time to get some questions answered. I realize that these applications are happening probably a little faster than some of our other grant programs, but still make sure to give yourself a little leeway to get that filled out before the deadline. Read the guidelines carefully just to make sure you haven't missed anything or that you're on the right track. You saw in the application that a lot of the questions have multiple parts to them, so make sure that you are addressing each of those parts. And then as we said before, keep your answers clear and concise. You don't need to worry about trying to pad out your answers to make it look longer or fuller as long as you are fully answering the questions. And don't feel like you need to be writing in any special grant language. It can be just like you are explaining this to a friend. We're asking our panelists to really focus on the content of the applications and not necessarily the actual writing. It's also a good thing to assume that the grant reviewers don't know anything about your organization or your project. We draw reviewers from our whole region, so it is very likely that they may not have heard of your organization. Also, be careful of using acronyms without spelling out what those are, or if there are particular programs that you, if you're just calling programs by a particular name and not really explaining what they are. So for that reason, it's a good idea to have somebody else read your application, especially if they aren't totally familiar with what you're doing, just to make sure that, again, there's not things that you're just assuming people know as they're reading your application. There are several ways for you to get assistance with your application. It's always a good idea to call us to talk about your project before you even start an application so we can make sure that you are under the right program before you get started. You can also contact us anytime with questions as you're working on your application. And finally, we as staff can review your application before you submit it. If you let us know about up to 2 weeks before the deadline, I know again, this is a quicker turnaround grant, but we can read through your application for you and let you know if there's something that you're missing, or if there was kind of a different direction that might work better for a question that you answered. So if you can let us know a little in advance, we can take a look at that for you. We as staff don't have any say in whether your application gets funded or not, so we're just here as your advocates. So what happens after you submit your application? First, we as staff will review it for eligibility and completeness. If we find at that point that there's still something missing, you'll get 48 hours to come up with that to fix whatever was a concern. And then all of the applications in that round will go on to a panel of individuals from around our region, and they will score those applications based on the criteria for the program, which we'll talk a little more about in a second. And then finally, their recommendations go on to our full board who makes final funding decisions. So the criteria that the panelists will be using to score this grant program are your ability to accomplish the project, which is worth 5 points, and the impact of the project worth 10 points. And if you go over to that link to the scoring criteria, there's a lot more details under these criteria, so you can check to make sure that you are including everything you need. Then after the panel has scored, applicants can also be awarded an additional percentage point for each of these following criteria that they meet. If they are a first-time SMOC applicant, if they are led by or primarily serving BIPOC or LGBTQ communities or people with disabilities, or if they are from a county that has received a smaller amount of grants from us in the last fiscal year. If your grant is awarded, you'll need to complete an online contract. And then after completing your contract, you'll receive 80% of your grant award around your start date. Again, with this compressed schedule, you might have to wait a week or two after your start date before you actually receive your funds. But you will get that 80% of the award up front. and then you'll receive the remaining 20% of the award after your project and your final report are completed. You'll need to acknowledge the grant on any publicity or other materials related to your project. There'll be a credit line that's included in your grant contract that you'll need to include on that. And you may also need to include this Minnesota Legacy logo, depending on which funds were assigned to you. But we will send you the credit text, logos, posters, so you don't have to worry about whether you have the right language included. Then you'll need to do a final report, which is due 60 days after your project end date. It's a good idea to go into the final report when you're just starting your project so you know what kind of information you'll need to gather, attendance and costs and outcomes, but you can take a look at that ahead of time. We do expect that you're going to spend what you said you were going to in your budget. This would not be the time to be looking for ways to save money in different places. We really need you to spend out the full amount of your grant. If it looks like something in your expenses is going to change, just contact us and you can get those changes approved. That was it for our quick support grants. I just want to point out a couple other opportunities we have coming up. We've got a couple more webinars for organizations in the near future. July 7th will be about our art projects. The next deadline coming up for that program is August 18th. And then July 27th will be the webinar for our full equipment and facilities improvement grants. And the next deadline for that will be September 8th. Here's just some contact information for us. That is all that I have for our presentation today. So if you like, I will just open things up and feel free to ask any questions about your specific project. I'm not hearing any other questions. Feel free to contact me anytime if you would like to talk about a project that you're thinking of. Otherwise, thanks for joining us tonight, and we look forward to hearing from you.